Hi there, I am Amelia Fabricius. This is my Module 16 case study, Missing Booster Club Funds for EDL 854. Okay, what do we know? So about this case study, we know that George Washington Middle School serves about 450 students, so it's a relatively small middle school. The population and the socioeconomics of the community have been on the decline. However, there is still a lot of parent involvement, and they have a good PTA, a good booster club. Mr. Daniel Stevens is the principal, and he is well liked by students, staff, and the community. He's been in that position for 4 years, and because the school is smaller, he does not have an assistant principal, so he pretty much has to take on all of the responsibilities himself. Also, we know about this case. Mrs. Bowman is a mother of 3 in the school district. Her 2 sons are out of middle school, but her daughter is a 7th grader. And her daughter is on the cheerleading squad, and she is a rather skilled cheerleader. And she qualified to be a part of like an all-state parade in New York City. And Mrs. Bowman is also an active member of the PTA. She's been involved with that. And she recently has requested that to the principal that the PTA pay $700+ for her daughter's trip, which would include her flight, hotel, and food for like 3 or 4 days. Mr. Stevens denied that request in a meeting he had with Mrs. Bowman that she had requested, because he saw that it was unfit for the PTA to cover that cost, being as it was just 1 student. And he tried to justify it by saying, think if it was another student for a different reason, I just don't think we can do that. So he denied that request. So then in this case, shortly after this conversation, Mrs. Bowman was working an event, a game, a gate, and funds went missing. Tickets went missing, and it just suspiciously happened shortly after that conversation. What do we need to know? So first, we need to know who the 4 members of the PTA that worked the gates for that event. One of them was Mrs. Bowman, but we need to find out who else was working it, and have they done it before? How familiar? What the process are they? Are they good to go with the procedures? Has anything ever gone wrong similar to this before with any of them working? What's the history? We also know that a local guy, Mr. Dumas, he paid with a $50 bill. And he had told Mr. Stevens this, told the principal this, even though Mr. Stevens never actually saw the bill. But when he counted it, that $50 bill was missing. It was nowhere to be found. So we need to confirm with somebody to know that Mr. Dumas actually paid with that 50. And also we need to confirm that maybe there was change, 50 was needed for change for some reason. So to confirm those things, that's what we need to know. Also, Mrs. Bowman had left a note in the bag that 10 tickets had been torn and were not accounted for, and they had been thrown away. We need to know if those tickets could be found, and if someone else had seen them, whether it be a janitor, another worker, something of this sort. So we need to do some inquiring. I need to do some inquiring of those things as well. Also, once again, has there ever been an issue like this before with Mrs. Bowman when she's worked events? She's worked some before, but as her history, she got a clean slate. I mean, just making sure, brushing up that something like this hasn't happened before. And what were Mrs. Bowman's reaction to being turned down with the PTA funds for her daughter's trip? So the problem here is that the tickets sold and the money collected don't match up. There's some discrepancy there, and they're not matching up. Also, numbered tickets are missing, And Mrs. Bowman was recently denied funds from the PTA, and Mr. Dumas supposedly paid with a $50 bill that is nowhere to be found. So ultimately, the issue of theft and money being gone is the outright issue. So my plan of action. First and foremost, I would talk to the superintendent of the district. Because I don't have an assistant principal or something of that sort, I'm going to discuss the issue with the superintendent so they know what's going on. Second, I would inform the bookkeeper of the issue so they know that things aren't adding up. Third, I would go straight to the event gate workers and determine if they saw the $50 bill, talk about those missing tickets, get that cleared up. I would compare their stories, and then I would see if there was simply a mishap, if there was something written down wrong, there was a confusion before any accusations happened there. Fourth, I would then talk to Mrs. Bowman. I would call her in and would discuss the issues, same as I did with the others. But then I would also have to discuss the suspiciousness of the timing, being that her daughter's trip had recently been denied funding from the PTA. Fifth, I would brush up on legalities. I would make sure that I'm handling things correctly. And if I had any questions regarding legal issues, I would use the school resources to make sure I was doing things correctly there. And then finally, I'm also going to be recording everything that I'm doing. I'm going to write things down, keep track of notes and conversations, just so we have a trail. Okay, to resolve the issue, ultimately to resolve it, I'm going to have to inform the workers that theft has happened. I will communicate to them that the goal is to locate the missing tickets and the money. If it can't be found, they will have to pay some consequences, such as taking away their right to work with any PTA funds. So working a gate, things like that, they would no longer be able to do. If the theft or the mishap was revealed, only those directly involved would be held accountable, and they would have to refund that missing money, and they would also have to pay those consequences. Then I would revisit the gate working procedures. I'll make sure that they're clear and purposeful and really make sure that people understand them, and really make sure that they're being enforced. And then I would also create some careful guidelines, and I think I would also create a detailed infographic and make sure that is available for anybody who's working those gates. So everyone's on the same page and those procedures are there and they're being enforced. So upon reflecting on this case study, to begin, I think Mr. Stevens could have potentially handled the request a little bit differently. He maybe could have spoke to the PTA rather than just determining that on his own. And maybe they could have, funded a small portion of that trip or, done something for the daughter rather than just shutting it down and saying, sorry, it's too much money, we can't afford that, or, it's one student, we can't do that. I also think Mrs. Bowman should never have disposed of those tickets if that's what she actually did. In today's world, with using technology and stuff, take a picture of those tickets or do something of that sort. Don't just write a note and say, oh, they were torn and thrown away. It's just not helpful, and it doesn't lead to anything good in her defense. I also struggle a little bit with the hearsay part of this study. That's not very hard evidence. Mr. Dumas, he said he used the 50, but that's a single testimony. I would need confirmation from somebody that he had used that for that information to be justifiable of, something that's going on. Also, this really reinforces the values of procedures. Dealing with finances, is a very important thing. And making sure those procedures are in place can prevent these mishaps. A principal must understand that mishaps will potentially happen, and they've got to be proactive rather than reactive to those situations. And I also really value trust and seeing how important that is here as an administrator, to be very transparent and build those relationships. Mr. Stevens did that. And so when an issue happens and he has to address it, people trust him and listen to him. And, that's working in his benefit. I also see, how this can be unfair to the student body. If funds are taken, ultimately it affects the student body, and that's not fair to them. I also think the PTA workers might suffer a little bit. It takes one bad situation to affect many others. And I also feel a little bit bad for Mrs. Bowman's daughter. I feel like she could have maybe gotten some type of support in her achievements. Okay, and then looking at Standard 8, promote academic learning for all students. Component number 1, Mr. Stevens caught the problem right away. He took immediate action, and he prepared consequences and took the initiative to change if needed. And the second component, Mr. Stevens' concern from the beginning was the entire student body. Mr. Stevens kept a good relationship with the community and the parents while enforcing procedures, and then ultimately doing something, once again, with the student body, the good of them in mind. And component number 3, Mr. Stevens is aware of his resources and he uses them to benefit all students. He's built good relationships, and that limits misuse, and that has played in his favor. He is aware of the funds being gone and is prompt in action, and doesn't sit back and ultimately is going to help the students out, because that's what that funding is for. My standards I have here, standard number 1, and we must communicate effectively, and we must model how to best use procedures and handle funds. Principal behavior is the most important. To be proactive, we must be aware of our actions and know to promote appropriate behavior, especially when handling funds. And then with the second standard, when an issue arises regarding finances, a school leader must be ethical and act in the appropriate manner. A leader cannot be biased. They must be honest and act fairly in regards to the school policy for the good of both the faculty and the staff and students. Thanks.